Hey everyone, welcome into Patterns Tell Stories. I'm your host Klaus, and today we're going to be talking about anomalous health incidents. With me today, as always, is my co-host Garrett. How's it going, man?
Really good, man. It's been a really good week. How have you been?
Doing okay. Today was a pretty crazy day. I just got done watching the 60 Minutes episode on Havana Syndrome. It's interesting that this came out a week after we were just talking about the two new studies on Havana Syndrome. And it sounds like this is some sort of answer to those. I mean, I'm sure this was in the works for a while. Maybe they were just waiting on the day to release it because they knew that the studies were coming. But either way, the timing is pretty good for this to come out because it actually gets into some new stuff that we hadn't heard before. And they actually name Russia as the most likely perpetrator behind these things. And it makes sense in terms of what we talk about a lot, these old psychotronic weapons programs that go back to beginning of the Cold War. They're reporting on 60 Minutes and with their partners, Der Spiegel in Germany and The Insider, which is another Russia-focused media outlet. It's sounding like a lot of this goes back to that time, and the resulting weapons that we're seeing are very, very real and are very, very effective in what they do. It sounds like people have pretty much had enough with the obfuscation that's coming from the intelligence community and the DoD. So we have people coming out on 60 Minutes in front of the country telling their story. They actually had to put on makeup. Some of them put on a disguise to tell their story about these anomalous health incidents. And I think it's important to note what Mark Zaid, who is the lawyer for a lot of the victims of anomalous health incidents, says about the actual term Havana Syndrome. He says that using the term Havana Syndrome does a disservice to the victims because this happens pretty much all over the world. It's a global thing where mostly Russians, we'll get into who specifically in the Russian intelligence services are doing this, but calling it Havana Syndrome really, I think it caused serious problems with foreign relations with Cuba because it basically just pigeonholed this whole thing into blaming it on the government in Cuba. But yeah, the lawyer's point was this is global and it's probably a good idea to stop referring to it as just being specific to Cuba, which makes sense to me. Just to get back to the beginning of the episode, that started out, there was a FBI agent who was hit with these attacks. They named her Carrie. Obviously, that was an anonymous pseudonym, and they disguised her because she's still an FBI agent working in counterintelligence. Back in 2021, she was at her home in Florida when she got hit by one of these weapons. And that's one of the crazy things is this is happening within the United States to our government employees, our intelligence officers, our FBI personnel are getting hit with these apparently microwave weapons. And the way she described it, I'll just read it real quick. She says, inside my right ear, it was like a dentist drilling on steroids. That feeling when it gets too close to your eardrum, it's like that times 10. It was a high-pitched metallic drilling noise, and it knocked me forward at like a 45-degree angle. My right ear was line of sight to the window while this thing was happening in my ear, and when I leaned forward, it didn't knock me over, it just knocked me forward. I immediately felt pressure and pain started coursing through my right ear, down my jaw, down my neck, and into my chest. And then her battery in her phone began to swell, and it popped. It broke the case, and then she passed out on the couch.
What the fuck?
Yeah. So because of the chest pain, she went to the cardiologist and returned to duty. That was just what they opened with in the 60 Minutes segment. I would really urge everyone to watch this just to get an idea. These people are distraught. They've been through something that you can tell is so traumatic and so awful and so unexpected. And it seems like it's shaken them and sort of changed the way that they see the world. And this Carrie person she just went back into the field. Yeah, so her phone burst and then she continued on. I remember complaining to my colleagues for months after that I felt like I had early Alzheimer's. Short-term memory, long-term memory, confusing memories, multitasking, my baseline changed. I was not the same person. So this is obviously something that severely fucks up your brain. Yeah, dude, it's gnarly.
Yeah, the gnarliest part was the guy talking about his little kid and holding his head up to her ear. And he said it sounded like, what did he say, running water? This guy's a Commerce Department official And he said that his wife, him, his 2 kids were all being targeted with whatever this was. And he said that it happened in China. He said that it happened again in Philadelphia at a hotel. And he said it sounded like water rushing.
Yeah, in one specific spot. And they were like thrashing around in their sleep, I think is how he framed it. It's terrifying.
One of the scariest parts of that is, like we said on this podcast, this doesn't come with receipts. I don't know. It's just extremely difficult by nature to trace this. I can also understand why they're hesitant to like point the finger in a really official way before they have their ducks in a row, because you don't want to get that wrong either.
I'm going to read a little bit from The Insider. They came out with a sort of companion piece to the 60 Minutes segment that really goes into the history of it and more details than they could have hit on. The segment's definitely effective in getting people to understand the seriousness of it and the human element. We'll also get into the parallels with the UFO cover-up as well in a bit, but I just wanted to go through this Insider article. It's called Unraveling Havana Syndrome. New evidence links the GRU's assassination unit 29155 to mysterious attacks on Americans at home and abroad. Well, GRU, first of all, is Russia's military intelligence agency. I think the analog for the U.S. would be the DIA. And I think a lot of the victims from these attacks are actually in the DIA. So Unit 29155 of the GRU was set up as a training unit, and it eventually sort of spawned into pretty much an assassination unit. They're basically a hit squad. They specialize in using these non-lethal weapons.
What I'm reading here about the GRU, for people who are curious, it says that it's a Soviet military intelligence organization. It had no formal connection to the KGB, the Soviet political police and security agency, though Western intelligence authorities believed that the KGB had agents within the GRU. Is it just kind of like how we have like an FBI and we have a CIA?
Yeah, it's the military side.
Okay.
So investigations showed that senior members of Unit 29155 were involved in developing non-lethal acoustic weapons, pretty much cause neurological harm and essentially the same sort of symptoms we heard about with Havana Syndrome since it started being reported on. This is the same unit that was involved in the Skripal poisonings in the UK. I think their main MO is intimidation tactics through violence. We've talked about on this podcast before the psychoenergetics programs that the Soviet Union had going on back in during the Cold War, and how that kind of tied into the Stargate program and just psychotronics in general. So the Insider received some classified Russian military documents that explained how, these programs worked back in the beginning of the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. It's stuff that wasn't in the Stargate, records release. I'm just going to read this section here. The Insider, 60 Minutes, and Der Spiegel have obtained a set of intelligence documents describing a classified Soviet-era program, codenamed Reductor, or Gearbox. Beginning in 1984 at the Radio Technical Measurement Research Institute in Kharkiv, Ukraine, Reductor's central task was to study the uses of, quote, electromagnetic radiation to influence the behavior and reactions of biological objects, including people, end quote. This is pretty much the psychotronic programs that we talk about a lot that involve both remote viewing and the more technological side of it. This is nothing new. We've known about this, and this is pretty much how it's tied into Havana Syndrome. The institute was subordinated to the Soviet Ministry of General Machine Building, which oversaw the Soviet Union's space exploration program. So here again, we have the tie-in with psychotronics and space technology. The head of the research institute, according to the documents, flew to Moscow almost weekly to report on the progress of his work. In 1988, the institute initiated a top-secret program for which a separate department, known as the 8th Branch, was created. About 300 employees worked for the 8th Branch, whose activities were kept secret from the rest of the institute. Most of its employees were scientists, either active in the Soviet military or retired from it. Engineers and biologists predominated the ranks. Also on staff were psychiatrists. There was strict compartmentalization of work within the 8th Branch, such that one team didn't know what another was working on, and all employees were forbidden from recruiting scientists from other departments within the research institute. Does that sound familiar? Eighth branch scientists experimented with electromagnetic energy on rats and rhesus monkeys. Some of the animals died from exposure to thermal radiation. Others developed brain damage. The main goal, according to one reductor document, was to create a stable mechanism of information influence, i.e., forcing the object to take certain actions by influencing the brain and other organs using low-energy effect with a power flux density of no more than 10 microwatts per square centimeter. Coinciding with the end of the Soviet Union, and with it Ukraine's independence, Reductor's entire scientific yield was transferred from Kharkiv to Moscow by the KGB for further development. The Reductor documents indicate that a blueprint model of an electromagnetic device was clunky and conspicuous. Quote, a large dish on an automobile chassis with generators, antennas, and other equipment. Soviet experts were confident that a smaller, more mobile version of such a weapon could eventually be created, with an effective firing range of at least 100 meters. Separately, in 2010, another scientific research institute in Russia carried out work on the development of basic technologies for the creation of a new generation of sonar and acoustic weapon systems. Under this contemporary program, quote, an experimental model or prototype of portable ultrasonic non-lethal weapons was constructed such that it would be mounted onto commercial vehicles. The radial range of this device was limited to between 10 and 12 meters. In February to March 2014, the total yield of this study in sonar and acoustic systems, the technical documents and an experimental device, came into the possession of the GRU in concert with Russia's takeover of Crimea. In September 2022, the U.S. intelligence community released a classified report titled Anomalous Health Incidents Analysis of Potential Causal Mechanisms. That's a report that I talked about before and we've read on here. The report gives four, quote, core characteristics of AHIs: the acute onset of audio-vestibular sensory phenomena, including sound and or pressure, strong sense of locality or directionality, and the absence of known environmental or medical conditions that could explain it. One plausible cause for these symptoms, the report states, is microwave energy. Another is ultrasound, a high-frequency form of inaudible acoustic energy that can enter the body through the ear canal or other aspects of the head, causing potential disruption of the central nervous system, especially of the inner ear, where sound and balance are sensed. Both microwave and ultrasound energy can damage cells in the brain as well as open the blood-brain barrier, causing proteins from the damaged cells to leak into the spinal fluid and then into the bloodstream. These so-called biomarkers are metabolized by the body within hours to days, meaning that someone hit with an acoustic weapon would need to have their blood drawn almost immediately after an attack to detect this kind of evidence of injury. The former Kiev Station CIA officer who was hit in Hanoi in 2021 was one of the only two victims of Havana Syndrome whose biomarkers had been measured before the attack, thus establishing an individualized baseline. In this officer's case, the biomarker levels jumped from normal before the attack to far above normal hours after. They then returned to normal days later, clearly indicating brain injury at the time of the attack. He was diagnosed with, quote, neural network dysfunction and persistent dysautonomia due to traumatic brain injury. And yet it remains unclear exactly how the attacks were carried out or whether multiple types of devices have been used. The limiting factor with ultrasound weapons is distance. Their sound waves travel poorly through air and solid objects found in buildings, meaning any device of this type would have to get up close to its target, no more than 10 or 12 meters away. Another form of directed energy that travels farther and can penetrate through thicker substances, such as walls and metal barriers, is pulsed microwave energy. The shape of an electromagnetic pulse that could do the kind of physiological harm seen in AHI cases would show an extremely steep rise, with each pulse reaching peak energy within less than a nanosecond. A U.S. intelligence community expert panel tasked with assessing the potential causes of Havana Syndrome concluded that this type of energy could, quote, fracture membranes and capillaries, damaging the sheaths that encase neurons and the blood-brain barrier. As Operation Reductor shows, Moscow has been experimenting with both types of directed energy weapons for a long time. Dr. David A. Relman, a microbiologist at Stanford University and a co-chair of the expert panel, told Insider that elements of reductor as described in the documents, quote, align with what we and others have hypothesized and thus are troubling in their implications. As we stated in the report, the kinds of injuries we propose to be caused by special forms of pulse microwave energy would not be expected necessarily to show up on brain imaging studies. These documents and their origins would appear to be clearly worth pursuing. Once that pursuit begins, there is potential for it to lead to some very disturbing places. The Kirov Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg, Russia, is headed by the aforementioned GRU consultant Sergei Chipor, a specialist in nerve agents like Novichok, which is what they used in the Skripal poisoning. But it's the specialist's research work that presents the greatest cause for concern. Judging from his publications, he's not only a specialist in biochemistry, but also in the effects of radiation on the brain. The Kirov Academy he heads is one of the few institutions in Russia that has studied minor syndrome. Yeah, man, I don't know. That's nuts. Sounds like this is going to lead somewhere that we've been talking about since the beginning of this podcast.
Dude, do you see Lou Elizondo's face when they ask him about Havana Syndrome? His answer, by the way, is not, oh, no, that's nothing to worry about, guys. It's all good. He's like, the point I'm making is like, people are noticeably nervous about this, who clearly have been exposed to information that is much more classified than I have been exposed to. Makes you nervous.
Mark Zaid is a lawyer for the victims of these AHIs, and they asked him on 60 Minutes what he thought of this IC assessment came out in 2022. And he said, I've had access to classified information relating to AHI. I can't reveal it. I wouldn't reveal it. I will tell you that I don't believe it to be the entire story, and I know of information that undermines or contradicts what they are saying publicly. And he's asked, are you saying the government wants to cover this up? And he says, there is, in my view, without a doubt, evidence of a cover-up. Now, some of that cover-up is not necessarily that, oh, we found a weapon and we don't want anybody to know about it. What I've seen more so is we see lines of inquiry that would take us potentially to answers we don't want to have to deal with. So we're not going to explore any of those avenues. So that's the lawyer who's been exposed to classified info on this, saying it's not about the weapon, it's about the questions that will be asked further down the line. I think that's where it ties into the UFO phenomenon, is that the power density for these weapons, the materials that they have to be made of, have to withstand the power density to shoot these microwaves from a distance. Most of the studies I've read have said that, most devices wouldn't be able to handle that if you're going to shoot it power density that high through these walls and all that shit. You need some sort of material that's going to be able to handle that. Potentially, at least my theory is that the materials that are required to handle this technology aren't public knowledge and may, in fact, be reverse engineered from potentially non-human technology. Those might be the questions down the line that are going to be asked about these weapons. And the lawyer's saying it's not about the weapon, it's about the lines of inquiry that questions about the weapon will open, those avenues.
It's so shocking to me how there's people out there that are so dismissive. That's something that I noticed this week before this 60 Minutes special came out, was in the lead up to this week. I don't know if you noticed, but the skeptic guy, Michael Shermer, started tweeting about how Havana Syndrome, he was very dismissive towards it. Mick West has also been very dismissive towards this. Before even hearing what these people have to say, it's very bizarre to me that it almost seemed like they were trying to jump the gun, get ahead of the headlines, because if you go online right now and you type in 60 Minutes, the first thing you're going to see is 60 Minutes Havana, 60 Minutes Havana Syndrome, because people heard this guy talking about holding his head up to his daughter's head and they're concerned. Naturally, people are going to go online and Google, what is Havana Syndrome? And there's people out there writing, very confidently that this is mass psychosis and nothing to worry about. I think that that's just about the most rotten thing that somebody could be saying on that topic, because I don't think that we've gotten sufficient evidence to say that nothing is going on or that this is mass psychosis. I don't know, man. It seems really bizarre to me that there's people out there trying to move on. It's very creepy to me. Sharon Weinberger has written about this. And it was one of the reasons why I started reading about this was an article she wrote when she wrote for Wired. But now she's a national security editor for the Wall Street Journal. But she wrote a great article about psychotronics and this becoming a potential arms race in the future between the United States and Russia, and goes into pretty deep detail about how our Department of Defense is interested in this. We're interested in protecting against it. She kept talking about all these private companies. It wasn't that it was just government agencies. It was all private companies in the United States and Russia. It seems like people aren't processing that when they just point at the CIA for doing something or point at the FBI for having some agent provocateur or classic conspiracies that we hear all the time. These companies can absolutely have their own little intelligence apparatus.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Look at Boeing, for example. I'm not saying, actually, maybe we shouldn't look at Boeing. Let's pick someone else. Maybe we could pick someone else. Boeing just randomly, I don't know, but for...
out of a hat, Boeing.
Yeah. So, for example, they had people coming forward that didn't have great things to say about Boeing. How
and
crazy would it be?
If anything happens to me, I didn't kill myself.
Yeah, we're far past that, dude. It's companies. It's private companies and contractors.
Yeah. It's honestly disgusting that the government is just trying to move on. Like you said, there are the skeptics who are at the talking heads and all that. But the most frustrating thing to me is the people who are the victims of this. They are probably the most patriotic people, and they know the risks of speaking out about something like this because they're intelligence officers. They want to keep classified stuff classified. They want to protect classified information from getting out. But they're the ones who are getting that used against them. It must take a lot for people who live in the shadows and understand the benefits of keeping this quiet. But at the same time, it's being used against them to discredit them so that the government doesn't have to deal with whatever the fuck is going to come of this. It's really, really sick, honestly, because I'm sure the victims did everything they could to go through the right channels and keep as much of this under wraps as possible before going on fucking 60 Minutes.
Didn't they stop Kamala Harris's, not saying Kamala Harris had Havana Syndrome, but before she was planning a trip to Vietnam, isn't that when certain American diplomats were attacked?
Yeah, they postponed it because of that. And there was an attack at a NATO summit, I believe. It was getting insanely brazen. The other interesting thing and potential connection to UFOs is the FBI agent, Carrie was her name we talked about before. She called these weapons next generation weaponry. These people aren't the kind of people to embellish things. These are intelligence officers. They're very serious. They're very patriotic. And they wouldn't be doing this. They wouldn't be going on 60 Minutes and calling out their own government if they didn't have a good reason to. So when she says it's next generation weaponry, that says to me, they still don't know what it is. There was no conclusion on 60 Minutes. Yes, it's microwave weapons. This looks like microwave weapons. It is a weapon. These are directed attacks at specific American diplomats and intelligence officers. That's about as far as it goes. The rest of it's classified still. I think one thing to hit on is the program called Reductor that initially started this stuff in 1984. Their central task was to study the uses of electromagnetic radiation to influence the behavior and the reactions of biological objects, including people. This is MK Ultra shit. This is the same stuff that we talk about all the time on this podcast. It's mind control.
Programming. Yeah. Behavior modification.
Yep. This is attempts at mind control. And they basically are I don't give a fuck what it does to their brain. And that's what Carrie said. The FBI agency, she said, we're guinea pigs. Yeah, this is the quote from Carrie, the FBI agent. She said, we're dealing with energy weapons. It's not going anywhere. Look at how effective it's been. It's next generation weaponry. And unfortunately, it's been refined on some of us, and we're the test subjects. This is basically behavior modification, electromagnetic psychotronics. That's the end goal here.
So I have two things from Jacques Vallée in front of me, and then one of them from John Keel. The first thing is in the book Confrontations, where he talks quite a bit about the biological effects of UFO contactees. The very end of the book, it says, an obvious biological effect of microwaves is that they heat tissue. Brain temperature changes of only a few degrees have been shown to cause convulsions, unconsciousness, and amnesia in rats. Even weaker microwave pulses, too weak to heat animal tissue, can have serious effects by disturbing cell membranes. Howard Wachtel and his colleagues at the University of Colorado have shown that the activity of nerve cells could be temporarily altered by a single microwave pulse. They've also observed a brief depression in the electroencephalograms of rodents exposed to similar pulses. And they add that, quote, the effects of such pulses on humans is unknown. In his review of the field, Dr. Keith Florig, an expert on policy issues involving ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, notes that, quote, HPM weapons that merely stun the nervous system temporarily seem like short-acting chemical agents to be more humane than lethal force. HPM weapons that blind, burn, or bake people to death are likely to be viewed as an abhorrent addition to the arsenal. It seems that the objects observed in Brazil had no such reservations. Interestingly, Dr. Florig remarks that, quote, the difference between a disabling and a lethal force is largely one of range, so it would be hard to show that a weapon intended to disable could not be lethal at short range, end quote. The power requirements of beam weapons are such that they will be deployed initially either on land or large ships. It is difficult to conceive in our present state of technology of a pulsed microwave beam carried aloft by anything as small as a chupa, but perhaps a weapon designed only to disable humans on the ground would not need to be heavy and large. Here again, the UFOs seem to represent an alien force that anticipates our own scientific development by decades, mocking our efforts to identify its nature and its long-term intentions. Understandably, the military establishment does not feel comfortable with the disclosure of our weakness any more than the scientific establishment feels inclined to confessing its ignorance. Future progress will have to come from a few individuals with enough courage to go into the field themselves to meet the unknown face to face.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And I know what I was talking about before is that in order to have this much energy to elicit the symptoms that we're seeing in Havana Syndrome, it's really, really hard to do it with a device that's handheld. Something that can withstand that kind of energy itself has to be big. Like they have these things like sitting on the top of like fucking trucks and shit. I think it has to be made of some sort of material that can really contain the energy. That in itself would make sense to me, some sort of metamaterial and not, just a regular fucking piece of metal.
You've seen the active denial system. People call that ADS, but that's something that when I was learning about this area, what they call like non-lethal weapons, and the area John Alexander is an expert in.
LRAD, long-range acoustic device, or whatever that is.
Yes. So if you Google active denial system, it's the first thing that comes up. It says the active denial system is a non-lethal directed energy weapon developed by the U.S. military, designed for area denial, perimeter security, and crowd control. Informally, the weapon is also called the heat ray, since it works by heating the surface of targets, such as the skin of targeted human beings. Manufacturer, Raytheon. So this thing is, yeah, I like how they added that in. This thing, it seems like they tow it around on like a big Humvee looking.
Yep,
part,
exactly.
And they'll just park it somewhere. And if they want to disperse a crowd, they can just like turn it on. If you were just visually looking at someone that this was being used on, physically, you couldn't see any change. But inside them, all the people within that range of the ADS, they feel like they're just like burning up.
The lady who got hit in her laundry room, I can't imagine like getting hit with that and then looking out my window and seeing like this fucking 20-year-old Russian dude. He was in a Mercedes SUV crossover. So this isn't like a Humvee. There's something that has to fit like a handheld thing. I don't know what kind of materials can do that. Because everything I've seen, it's mounted on the fucking destroyers, the Navy destroyers and stuff. And it seems like you need a special material.
Remember that Donald Rumsfeld press conference that we were talking about? He gets asked about directed energy and he immediately jumps to UAV.
Yeah, that's true.
And it makes me wonder if this type of thing is being used in space weaponry.
I'm sure it is.
If that's even a thing, or satellites, is a satellite considered a space weapon? Like, I don't know. I don't think any of those things are classically considered weapons.
Well, I mean, it depends on the payload. Yeah. All the payloads are generally classified, so they could shoot up whatever they want. We wouldn't know.
Later in his career, Andrea Puharich was real outspoken about ELF, extra low frequency waves, and he thought that he was constantly being attacked with ELF waves. He went on TV and gave an interview and said that he was being bombarded and that planes were nosediving his house. And thousands of times this has happened. I remember being like, what? I'm not saying that the guy is lying, but at the same time, I noticed that he talked about it a whole bunch. And then his closest associates at a certain point, Uri Geller, he never talks about ELF, ever. And I just noticed that. I don't know if that's something important to notice.
That is interesting.
There was a growing list of people that I noticed they don't even want to go that direction when it comes to the phenomenon. And Uri Geller is one of them. This is what Uri Geller says if you type in at the Uri Geller Havana Syndrome. He tweeted on April 1st, 2022, he tweeted, "I know what causes Havana Syndrome, and it is not microwaves or sonic weapons. It has now been reported in over 8 countries, and the victims tended to be diplomats or government officials. This is, quote, psychic terrorism, and I believe there will soon be an attack on a head of state, exclamation point." Yeah, I find that bizarre as fuck.
Yeah, this reductor program, I mean, it seems like just a continuation of what they've been doing forever. If a week ago the DOD came out, we can't find anything on these MRIs, and if they know damn well that whatever these weapons are not going to show up on an MRI or the effects of them, there has to be something they're covering up. This isn't just, we don't want to tip off Russia. Whatever the obvious thing is, again, it's not that. It doesn't make sense for them to just deny that children are getting their brains blasted with microwaves. There is something at stake here that's so much bigger that they're trying to not acknowledge. Once again, I think that's where the connection to UAP comes in. Just based on all this stuff, there might have been some sort of intelligence failure at some point. The fucking Russians got our secrets for the atomic bomb. Why wouldn't they have an effective way to get secrets from the legacy programs? It's the legacy UAP programs. That would be a horribly embarrassing thing. UAP technology can be exploited to make different things, a lot of different things. And obviously, directed energy weapons would be one of those. If this, in fact, was, whatever these materials that can contain these energy densities were manufactured based on UAP technology, this whole investigation into anomalous health incidents could lead back to the legacy programs.
When Chris Mellon was on Joe Rogan's show, he was talking about the U.S. Embassy in Havana and how in the construction of it, in the because it closed for a while and then Obama reopened it, I believe. Pretty soon after that, they started reporting these adverse reactions to spending time there. He said that when they were reconstructing it, they were finding all these abnormalities in the old building and said that it had all these weird antenna that they didn't originally put in there. One of the things Mellon pointed out was that it's certainly possible that this is a byproduct of a technology that could be scraping electronics, that they're pointing it at a computer, and maybe it's a byproduct of a human being close to the computer. But maybe they're really after the computer. And even in the scenario with the guy with his kids, maybe that guy has an iPad or some hard drive in his house that you can scrape electronically using that technology. I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just hypothetically, maybe that's one of the things that could be going on here. We're seeing now you can charge your phone just by setting it on a surface. That's not that many steps away from just holding your phone above a surface.
Mark Zaid, the attorney, actually said that. He said there are dozens of CIA cases that happen domestically that is at least believed. And we're not even talking about just physical manifestation. We're talking about evidence of computer issues in the midst of the incident where computer screens just literally stop working and flicker on and off. So computers are affected by this, obviously. Seems like microwaves or some sort of wave.
I have another Jacques Vallée thing. I'm going to just keep reading Jacques Vallée because he's been talking about this for years. So this is from Fast Walker. This is a novel he wrote. And this actually picks up from a part I was reading from before, I believe, on a real old episode we did. He says, suddenly the old man was all business. I think that 1953 was the turning point. Ufology became a cover for mind control research. Forget the Robertson panel. They only reached the conclusion they did based on a few selected cases, biased data, and an aborted briefing from Battelle. They noted that the phenomenon was of marginal interest to science, not a threat to the nation, and should be debunked. They said the civilian UFO groups should be infiltrated and watched. That was predictable. They said there were no UFOs. What else could they say? Project Blue Book continued to serve as a lightning rod. They used Hynek. It was a public relations job. As I've already told you, behind the scene, ... He gestured towards a crowd passing on the sidewalk, the fellow who sold hot dogs at the corner, the kids going home after class. Look at all these people, the old man said. They obey unquestioned control systems. They get up when the sun rises. They go to sleep when the darkness comes. They cross the street when the light is green. They freeze in their tracks when it's red. They lead lives of utter drudgery, but they do vote, and tomorrow, if some politician tells them to go off to a faraway land with a loaded gun and die there for some obscure cause, they will do it. What is driving them is fear, like animals you see at the circus or rats in a maze. It was the second time in as many days that Keller had heard a human crowd compared to a bunch of animals. Quote, the flock, Colonel Trent had said. The old man went on with contempt in every word. Quote, they fear everything, a God they've never seen, their own wives, and also the leaders they've elected, the cops whose salaries they keep paying. They even fear themselves. They fear their own creativity. They stifle their own aspirations to be anything but fearful little beasts. Fairly stunned by his outburst, Peter felt glad they were the only customers left. He would have been embarrassed if they had been overheard. Yet, in an odd sort of way, the old philosophy professor was stirring thoughts that were his own. So what actually happened to ufology in 1953? A bifurcation. The Air Force went on overtly with a perfectly innocent project called Blue Book, which was not supposed to ever find anything. And the intelligence community created a covert, underground effort aimed at exploiting the popular belief in UFOs and at duplicating their efforts on human subjects. Peter sighed. You lost me again, he said. The old man patiently tried to explain. UFOs, whatever they are, can paralyze people and stop engines at a distance. If you were a military agency, wouldn't you want to understand how that's done? That would mean conducting experiments with everything from simple flashing lights to pulsed microwaves. You mean like radar beams? If you like, but over a lower range of intensity. Otherwise, you would simply cook your subject from the inside out. The effect of pulsed microwaves on the human brain is most varied and interesting, Peter. So is the effect of extremely low frequency at the other end of the electromagnetic spectrum. You can induce hallucinations, make people hear words, change their mood, perhaps even invoke visual images. But you won't find much of this data in the open literature. You ramble, Desmond, said Peter. What does this have to do with flying saucers? Maybe nothing. I hope to God it has nothing to do with it. I would like to believe, as most ufologists do these days, that we are simply being visited by warm fuzzies with big black eyes who come from Epsilon Eridani. But you don't think that's the answer? No, damn it. I don't think it fits the situation. I think we're being shamelessly manipulated. By whom? Suppose you could make a lot of people believe that they were about to be invaded by extraterrestrials. It's a simple idea. Anybody can grasp it. You'd start with the elite, the intellectuals, the artists. Gradually, you'd have the media spreading the imagery. People like you, Peter. It wouldn't work. The media doesn't have that much power. Basically, we're just entertainers. The scientists would always remain skeptical. The man shrugged, dismissing the notion. Who cares about them? Scientists don't shape public opinion. They've contradicted themselves too many times. They confuse everybody. In a world of mutual assured destruction, where war has become impossible, something has to replace weapon development. Something has to keep the economy going, the people in line, the populace in its place. They have to fear something, right? Otherwise, you'll end up with ungovernable chaos. Look at Bosnia. Look at Africa. Look at what's left of the USSR, for heaven's sake. So you would engineer a whole new source of fear. Is that what you're saying? Fear of aliens from the end of the galaxy? Exactly. Our gods always come and go in the sky, don't they? The dragons of China, the pillar of fire, the Virgin Mary, even Jesus, in every culture. Except in this century, the old gods have trouble impressing the techno wizards. They're not very credible. They can't just send us the old dreams and visions. Burning bushes don't fool anybody anymore. We need to build a whole new pantheon. That's where ET comes in. And those guys, the geniuses within the intelligence community, you believe they thought of that back in 1953? Why not? If you can manufacture an H-bomb or a microwave beam that can stop tanks and confuse brains, surely you can also manufacture the appropriate new religion to go with your new toys.
The original secret machines.
For real.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I wanted to read something Tom said in 2015. So Tom DeLonge did an interview with Paper Magazine in 2015. And this was way before all the Havana Syndrome stuff started coming out in the news or anything was reported about it. He basically talks about anomalous health incidents before anyone ever said anything about it. He says, you have to understand, I've been involved in this for a long time. I have sources from the government. I've had my phone tapped. I've done a lot of weird stuff in this industry. People wouldn't believe me if I told them. But this is what happens when you start getting on an email chain with hundreds of scientists from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and different universities across the country. Start outing senior scientists from Lockheed Martin talking about the reality of this stuff. Guys that hold 30 patents, guys that work underground in the Nevada test sites in Area 51. So they ask, you've had your phone tapped? And it says, yeah, I did for quite some time. Years ago, there was somebody who was gathering 150 hours of top secret testimony specifically for congressional hearings on government projects and the U.S. secret space program. People from NASA, Rome, the Vatican, you name it, they're all on there. The top 36 hours that summarize the best parts of all that footage, I had it hidden in my house for a period of time. And during that time, I was flying this person out, along with somebody that was Werner von Braun's right-hand assistant. Werner von Braun was a Nazi scientist that we brought over to build our Apollo rockets that got us to the moon. And on his deathbed, he told this person a bunch of stuff, and I was flying them out to Los Angeles, and we were taking certain meetings. That time, a lot of weird stuff started happening. They asked, were you concerned about your safety at all? And he says, partially, because they do weird stuff. At the time, I didn't know it, but the person I was dealing with was being awoken in the middle of the night with clicking and buzzing noises and falling on the ground vomiting every morning at 4 a.m. I know now that those are artifacts from mind control experiments, where the same technology that we use to find oil underground, we can zap somebody at the same frequency that the brain operates on, and it can cause some really horrific things to happen. But I didn't know this until 10 years later. I got caught in the middle of it, and this was the time where I was on the cover of Rolling Stone. So I think these guys, whoever was running this operation, were like, what the fuck? How did this kid show up? He literally says the exact symptoms of anomalous health incidents, even with the vomiting thing. One of the victims in the 60 Minutes episode tonight said she started just projectile vomiting all over the place in her bathroom when she got hit with this weapon. He knew. He knows his shit. I don't know. It's wild.
Yeah, they were talking about that on Joe Rogan. Who was it that was describing how Tom DeLonge had warned him?
Black Keys, I think, the drummer for the Black Keys was talking about how Tom told him all this crazy shit like 3 years ago, and it all came true. And that's the other thing Tom says is that this is the same technology we use to find oil underground, which means it's sound. At least part of it is sound, or it's amplified with acoustic frequencies.
Don't we find oil underground with satellites too?
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of ways, actually. Like, you can do it with like gravity anomalies. They use like seismic waves to determine densities within the crust of the Earth.
So this comes from the conclusion of the paper by Jacques Vallée and Eric W. Davis, Incommensurability, Orthodoxy, and the Physics of High Strangeness, a 6-layer model for anomalous phenomena. In the conclusion, this is what it says. Modern engineering has made us familiar with display technologies that produce three-dimensional images with color, motion, and perspective through physical devices. We speculate that UAP are analogous to these display technologies, but utilize a wider range of variables to operate on the percipients and through them on human culture. The long-time scale and the global nature of the effects make it difficult to test hypotheses involving such cultural effects. Science fiction has familiarized us with the concept of machines or beings projecting an image of themselves that systematically confuses observers. One could imagine that UAP represent physical craft equipped with the means to interact both with the surrounding atmosphere and with the senses of observers in such a way as to convey a false image of their real nature. One could argue that such an object could use microwave devices to create perceptual hallucinations in the witnesses, including messages that are heard or seen by a single individual in a group. Even such a complex scheme, however, fails to explain all the reported effects and the subsequent behavior changes in close-range witnesses. We must assume something more, the triggering of deep-seated processes within their personality. The question then becomes, to what extent are these effects evidence of a purposeful action of the operators? To answer this question, and to test more fully the hypothesis that UAP phenomena are both physical and psychic in nature, we need much better investigations, a great upgrading of data quality, and a more informed analysis, not only of the object being described, but of the impact of the observation on the witnesses and their social environment. In other words, we need to develop a multidisciplinary methodology that encompasses all 6 of the layers we have identified and can be applied to SETI as well as to other UFO phenomena and close encounters with the entities associated with them. Such a methodology would open the way to rational testing of hypotheses in an important domain that has been sorely neglected by mainstream science for too long. I know I read a lot of Jacques Vallée, but he's written a lot about microwaves in the past. All throughout the 60s, 70s, and up until like his modern books, he mentions microwave-like effects on people who have described their encounter. I think that a lot of the time when I'm reading his books, it sounds like he wants to say these things, but like can't directly. None of the times that I see people that have clearly been involved with or exposed to classified information about this topic, when they're asked about Havana Syndrome or when they're asked about microwave weapons or asked about directed energy, their responses make it very clear they can't give you a full answer, but it's definitely not that there's nothing to see here. It seems just like really, really sinister. If they did determine that Russia was doing that, does that mean like it's on, a war begins? And is that why they are hesitant, or one of the reasons why they're so hesitant? Because it's like the world might end if somebody
pretty much
says that the other side is doing this.
Yeah, they're being assholes. Putin's ranting about nukes, and the whole geopolitical aspect of it is definitely touchy and could definitely lead to some scary outcomes. I don't know. You just deny that children are getting blasted with microwaves and expect everyone to be cool about it. That's not sustainable. I don't know what they expect to do. They should have had something figured out years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if this is worth including because it seemed insane, but it was Thomas Bearden giving a presentation about directed energy was one of many things that he was discussing, but he was talking about this embassy in Havana. The way he was describing it, it sounded like a chess match of like these covert areas because they were targeting people that it wasn't just like your everyday Joe. It was like high-level diplomats, like we were saying earlier. People like the vice president were getting nervous because of how close this seemed to be getting to like areas they were about to travel to. If some group was doing that and trying to send some message, it's like, that's a pretty bold message to send. It's like the vice president's about to show up somewhere.
Yeah.
And you're using this type of technology potentially. But anyway, Thomas Bearden was describing it like when one side notices that the other side is doing something, they're potentially going to take countermeasures. And then the spies are also going to report on the countermeasures that they're taking. And they're going to notice the countermeasures and like the type of attention the other side pays to it. It's almost like both sides pushing each other's hands, not wanting to show each other how much they know about what the other one can do in the covert world. But it's all things that they can't really like just go to war on because it's so secret.
That's a lot of what the geopolitics is between the US and Russia, is the US exposing intelligence that it knows about Russia at the right time. Like when they were going to invade Ukraine, we basically said, hey, they're going to invade Ukraine right before they did. It's that kind of thing where you have the intelligence. It just depends on when you use it for your own advantage. This is gnarly.
What do you got?
Yeah, one of the things in Kit Green's paper says thermoelastic expansion and contraction of fluid spaces in the brain can result in the perception of clicks, buzzing sounds, and humming. So if that's what people are hearing, like the expansion and contraction of fluid spaces in the brain, that's gnarly.
You're the one that brought up Mind Snap a couple episodes ago. Mind Snap is like right here in that ballpark of like, God, it's like a Black Mirror episode when you talk about what these technologies do, because you're just like messing with people's nervous systems. And that's how we perceive. That's everything, dude. If you lose your nervous system, then like
you're fucked.
Yeah. It's a good way of putting it.
I just wanted to express support for the victims of anomalous health incidents. It can't be easy to be in that position where you're trying to keep information about national security safe, but at the same time, ask for the help that you need to deal with such an awful, awful thing that's happened. Families as well. It's really, really sick. My heart goes out to the people who had to deal with this shit. Can't be easy. And especially after seeing what I did tonight on 60 Minutes, you can tell it's traumatic. I truly hope that this kind of public acknowledgement, at least by one of the last few actual investigative journalism shows, leads to a conclusion that gets people the help they need. Going through life with these fucking injuries just without, any acknowledgement, I couldn't imagine that. My heart goes out to all of you, and I'm sure you got better stuff to do than listen to this podcast. But I just wanted to say that. But thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.